An unimaginable betrayal is about to shake the foundations of the most respected archaeological institute in the country. Melanie, a young woman invisible to the prestigious historian Alexander Warren, discovers that Theo, Alexander's right-hand man and confidant, is hiding secrets capable of destroying legacies and breaking hearts. But will anyone listen to a museum guide without a voice amid so much power and prestige? Melanie Bennett never imagined her tedious routine at the museum was the prelude to something so grand. Every day, she found herself surrounded by artifacts carrying millennia-old secrets, but her life was, ironically, as predictable as the museum's visiting hours. Young and filled with dreams she barely dared to admit out loud, she settled for guiding tourists through relics while her thoughts wandered to expeditions that seemed forever out of reach. Deep down, she felt destined for something greater, even though no one but herself believed it. Meanwhile, Alexander Warren was an imposing figure in the academic world. Renowned for his historical discoveries that unveiled mysteries of the past, he was the embodiment of someone living their dream. His institute was a global reference, and by his side stood Theo, a loyal and efficient shadow. To Alexander, Theo was more than a colleague. He was a confidant, a friend. A partner in whom he placed unshakable trust, perhaps too much so. Melanie, on the other hand, was little more than an invisible cog in the machine. Her talent was buried under layers of insecurity and an unchanging reality. Her days were marked by distracted visitors and exhibitions that fascinated everyone except the team who assembled them. She watched life pass by as if she were a spectator, while the objects she loved remained untouched by her hands. Frustration came like a constant breeze she tried to ignore. The irony of the situation was glaring. Melanie lived surrounded by the past, by stories of courage and twists of fate, but hers seemed trapped in an endless cycle. Every guided tour was a reminder that her dreams remained shelved. But as much as she tried to accept it, something inside her always seemed to whisper that her story wouldn't be so simple. She just needed to find a way to change its course. Alexander, for his part, never questioned Theo's loyalty. To him, stability was a foundation, and Theo represented that. But the truth is, every legacy has hidden secrets, sometimes right under the nose of its creator. And while Alexander reveled in his confidence, a shadow was beginning to form around those he valued most. He didn't know it yet, but his world was about to collapse. For Melanie, frustration had another name: invisibility. Her superiors rarely acknowledged her talent, and even though she knew more about some artifacts than many historians, her opinions were never heard. But there was one thing no one could take from her: her passion. That passion, though dormant, still pulsed strongly, waiting for the right moment to awaken. What no one knew, not even Melanie, was that the right moment was closer than she imagined. A series of events was about to push her out of her comfort zone and into a path of difficult choices and revealing truths. And in that museum, where the past seemed to be the only thing that mattered, something very present was about to be uncovered. Alexander and Melanie had more in common than they realized. Both were passionate about their work but trapped in dynamics that limited them. He by his blind trust, she by her lack of recognition. And as time moved forward, their stories began to intertwine in unexpected ways. Melanie didn't yet know that soon her voice would be the key to changing not only her own life but also Alexander's. And he, in turn, was about to discover that not everything was as it seemed. The museum, until then a safe and predictable place, held far more secrets than they could imagine. And one of those secrets was about to explode. It was just another ordinary day at the museum, or so Melanie thought. The exhibition hall was in organized chaos, with interns running back and forth and the constant pressure to have everything perfect for the new showcase. Amid the frenzy, Melanie retreated to a side corridor to catch her breath. That's when she heard voices coming from a nearby room, muffled but clear enough for her to catch fragments of a conversation that would change everything. Theo was on the phone, his voice low but carrying a tone Melanie didn't recognize in him. He was talking about something too valuable to remain in the wrong hands and about a buyer willing to pay triple on the black market. Melanie froze. At first, she thought she had misheard. But as the words grew more direct, shock began to turn into a terrible certainty. Theo was planning to steal something from the institute and sell it. The weight of the revelation made her heart race. The map. Melanie remembered the institute's most recent discovery, a rare relic still undergoing authentication. It was the kind of find that would revolutionize the study of ancient civilizations, something Alexander considered his greatest triumph. Theo wanted to take it, sell it to a private collector, and erase any chance of history being rewritten through its discoveries. It was more than a betrayal of the institute, it was a crime against the past. As Melanie tried to process what she had overheard, her mind spiraled. Should she tell someone? Alexander, perhaps? But who would believe her? Theo was Alexander's right-hand man, the person he trusted most. She, on the other hand, was just a museum guide, an insignificant cog in the machine. The fear of being ridiculed or, worse, losing her job, made her hesitate. What if people thought she was making up stories for attention? Melanie tried convincing herself it wasn't her problem. Why risk everything? But Theo's voice kept echoing in her mind, and the image of Alexander, so proud of his achievements, accompanied it. He trusted Theo implicitly, and that trust was on the verge of being shattered. Something inside her began to rebel against the fear. If she stayed silent, she would be complicit through omission. She knew what was right, but did she have the courage to act? Meanwhile, Theo hung up the call with a calculated smile. He seemed satisfied, completely unaware that Melanie had heard everything. The tension in the museum continued as usual, and Melanie realized how easily Theo could execute his plan. No one would ever suspect him. This filled her with urgency and anguish. If she didn't act, it would be too late. The corridor seemed to narrow as Melanie walked back to the main hall. Each step was an internal confrontation, courage or omission. Despite trembling, she knew she needed to decide quickly. Letting it slide wasn't an option, but she wasn't sure she could confront Theo directly. All she knew was that Alexander had to be informed. It was the only chance to stop the disaster. Back in the exhibition hall, Melanie watched Alexander from afar. He looked so confident, so secure in his meticulously built world. She couldn't help but imagine how he would react. The thought of disrupting his peace almost made her backtrack. But the relic, the legacy, everything was at stake. And deep down, she knew the world never changed for those who preferred silence. With a deep breath, Melanie made her decision. She would tell Alexander. She didn't know how or when, but she knew she had to do it. And as she walked away, something inside her ignited. Maybe it was the courage she had always known was there but had never been called upon. The game was about to begin. Melanie spent the night wide awake. Every time she closed her eyes, she replayed Theo's conversation as if it were a tape stuck on repeat. The pressure of deciding what to do was crushing. She knew she couldn't simply ignore what she had heard, but the thought that no one would believe her wouldn't go away. Who was Melanie Bennett? Just an insignificant museum guide, a disposable piece in the grand puzzle that was the Institute. Meanwhile, Alexander dined alone at home. Sitting in his office, he reviewed notes on the discovery of the map. He barely noticed the shadow Theo cast over his unshakable trust. Memories of years of partnership made him dismiss any doubts that occasionally surfaced. Alexander was a man of logic, and the idea that Theo could betray him seemed absurd. It was easier to believe the world remained solid and reliable than to accept that the ground beneath him might give way. In the morning, Melanie dressed in her uniform with trembling hands. For a moment, she thought about letting it all go. Life was easier when she stayed in her corner, invisible and safe. But as she walked to the museum, her heart raced. The weight of responsibility felt overwhelming. If she failed, the Institute would lose something priceless, and she knew she couldn't live with that. In the exhibition hall, Melanie's gaze met Alexander's. He was engaged in a conversation with Theo, and the sight made her stomach churn. How could she approach him and say she suspected that man? Theo looked so natural, so much a part of the environment. Melanie almost nervously laughed at the absurdity of the situation she found herself in. It was a battle between David and Goliath, and she had neither the stone nor the courage. Alexander, on the other hand, remained in his bubble of certainties. Theo was more than a right-hand man. He was an extension of Alexander's own vision. If there was any flaw in his trust, he preferred not to see it. The weight of his responsibilities was immense, and his trust in Theo allowed him to share part of that burden. To think otherwise was to admit he might be alone in a world he believed was full of allies. Melanie made several attempts to approach Alexander. Once, twice, 3 times, but her throat seemed to close every time she got near him. Something in her still hesitated, clinging to the idea that she might be wrong. What if it was all a big misunderstanding? The risk of looking paranoid and losing the little credibility she had seemed too great to face. Finally, Melanie decided to seek advice from a close colleague. Sitting in the break room, she shared her dilemma with Sophia, another museum guide. But the reaction wasn't what she had hoped for. Sophia shook her head in disbelief. "Melanie, you must have misheard. Theo? Impossible. That guy practically breathes loyalty to Alexander." Sophia's words hit her like a punch, reinforcing the walls of doubt already built in her mind. However, at the end of the day, while organizing the exhibition's plaques, Melanie noticed something Theo had left on the table. A draft of a map, almost identical to the original locked in the Institute's vault. Her mind flooded with urgency. It was no longer a question of if, it was a question of when. Theo's plan was in motion, and she had to act, even if it meant risking everything. As Alexander reviewed contracts in the museum's office, a shadow of doubt began to creep in. Not because of Melanie, whom he barely noticed, but because of small details that recently didn't seem to fit. He brushed the thought aside, convincing himself it was exhaustion talking. But the idea was already planted. And Melanie, still battling fear, knew the moment of truth was approaching. When Melanie finally found the courage to approach Alexander, it felt as if every step toward his office was an endless climb. She knew it was her last chance to be heard before it was too late. But, standing before the solid wooden door, her hesitation returned. What would she say? How could she explain without sounding delusional? Gathering all the breath she could muster, she knocked on the door and entered before she could change her mind. Alexander was behind his desk, surrounded by piles of documents, so focused that he didn't immediately notice her presence. When he looked up, surprise crossed his face. It wasn't common for Melanie, or any museum guide, to enter his office unannounced. "Yes? What can I do for you?" he asked, his tone polite but distant. Melanie almost crumbled, but something in her determination pushed her forward. With a trembling voice, Melanie began recounting what she had heard. Every word felt like a weight as she tried to organize the facts. Alexander listened in silence, his expression closed and cautious. He was a meticulous man, and the idea of Theo, his longtime partner, being involved in something so sordid seemed unthinkable. However, there was something in Melanie's sincerity that made him pay attention, albeit reluctantly. "Do you realize what you're saying?" Alexander asked after a long silence. Melanie felt a lump in her throat but remained steadfast. "Yes, I know it sounds absurd, but I heard it clearly." He mentioned the map and talked about selling it on the black market. Alexander leaned back, crossing his arms, visibly torn. On one hand, he wanted to protect Theo. On the other, he knew he couldn't ignore such a serious accusation. Struggling with his own doubts, Alexander decided to consult the Institute's lawyer, a man experienced in identifying fraud and misconduct. If something is wrong here, he'll know, Alexander thought, trying to conceal his growing unease. The lawyer, James Klein, was known for his ability to separate fact from assumption, and Alexander knew he needed an impartial perspective. Melanie, though relieved to have been heard, felt slightly dismissed when Alexander waved her off with a nod. He didn't thank her or express any faith in her courage. But she knew she had done what she needed to do. As she left the office, she heard Alexander pick up the phone to arrange a meeting with James. It was a small step, but it was a start. Later that evening, as Melanie walked home, a mix of relief and anxiety overwhelmed her. She had done her part, but what would happen next? What if Alexander decided to ignore everything? Or worse, what if Theo found out she was behind it? These thoughts haunted her, but she knew there was no turning back. She had set the first domino in motion, and now all she could do was wait. Across town, Alexander sat in his office, now engaged in a tense conversation with James. He recounted the events and Melanie's accusation, doing his best to maintain a neutral tone. James listened carefully, taking notes and asking for details. "We'll investigate," he finally said. "But you need to be prepared for any outcome, Alexander. Even the ones you don't want to believe." As night fell, the initial steps to investigate Theo were set in motion. Still torn, Alexander began noticing details that had previously gone unnoticed. Small behaviors, subtle discrepancies in the Institute's records. The seed of doubt Melanie had planted grew in his mind, and he knew that soon it would be impossible to ignore. Melanie lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as her thoughts raced. She didn't know that, at that exact moment, something inside Alexander was also starting to shift. The first piece of the puzzle was in place, and both of them, in their own ways, were preparing to face what was coming. The following days at the museum were a delicate dance between growing tension and the effort to maintain appearances. Melanie tried to act as if nothing had happened, but every time she saw Theo, a chill ran down her spine. He continued his usual routine, with a friendly smile and calculated gestures. To an outsider, Theo appeared as trustworthy as ever. But to Melanie, he was now a dark enigma, full of lurking secrets. Alexander, on the other hand, was on high alert. What had once seemed like an unshakable bond of trust was beginning to crumble in his mind. Melanie's words echoed as he reviewed old records and scrutinized Theo's behavior more closely. Small slip-ups that he would have previously overlooked now seemed like glaring red flags. He realized he needed more than suspicions to confront the man he had so greatly admired. The investigation led by James Klein, the Institute's lawyer, marked the first step across the threshold. James began digging through documents, transactions, and expedition logs. Simultaneously, Alexander spent hours reviewing old notes and emails, searching for any hint of irregularities. The tension in the office was almost tangible, but both men knew the truth was approaching, and it could be devastating. Melanie, still feeling the weight of her decision, noticed that Alexander was observing her more than before. Not with suspicion, but with something she interpreted as curiosity. It was as if he was beginning to recognize something in Melanie he had previously underestimated. Even so, she felt her position was precarious. No matter what happened, she knew her courage would be tested again. As the investigation progressed, Alexander began to see the first concrete signs that something was wrong. Forged records, mismatched figures, and a pattern of behavior suggesting more than just negligence. But the hardest part to accept was that these clues seemed to lead directly to Theo. Alexander felt as though he were being dragged into an abyss, unable to believe that the man he trusted most could betray him so deeply. Theo, meanwhile, started to sense that something was amiss. Small details, indirect questions from Alexander, James's more frequent presence at the Institute, aroused his suspicions. He knew he was being watched and began to act with even greater caution, trying to protect his plan. But his confidence in his own ability to manipulate situations kept him moving forward, as if he believed he could escape any accusation unscathed. Melanie, in the meantime, felt like a spectator to a game she had set in motion but was now beyond her control. Her intuition told her Alexander was nearing a decision, but she also knew things might become even more complicated before they improved. The weight of her choice still followed her, but a spark of hope burned in her heart. Perhaps, for the first time, her voice was making a difference. When Alexander uncovered the first solid evidence, a financial discrepancy directly tied to an expedition Theo had led, he knew he could no longer ignore what was before his eyes. It was the point of no return. The trust he had built over the years was beginning to shatter. He understood he needed to press on, even if the truth was more painful than he was prepared to face. At the end of an exhausting day, Alexander called James to discuss the next steps. Both agreed that confronting Theo was inevitable, but they needed more evidence before taking action. For Alexander, this waiting period was a test of patience and resilience. He was crossing an invisible line, leaving behind the safety of his trust and stepping into unknown territory. Meanwhile, Melanie began to sense something different about Alexander. He seemed more introspective, more careful. She didn't know exactly what was happening, but she felt her decision to speak up was starting to have an effect. Still, both of them were far from imagining how deep this abyss might go. The tension at the institute reached new heights. Melanie, who had initially hesitated to get involved, now found herself at the center of a plot that seemed larger than herself. Her instincts kept her alert, and she started observing Theo more closely. Small details, furtive glances, discreet exits from the office, strengthened her certainty that he was hiding something. Still, she knew she couldn't act alone. Every move needed to be calculated. Alexander, on the other hand, was grappling with an internal battle. Theo was like a fortress, solid, impenetrable, always ready to justify any irregularity. When Alexander subtly questioned him, Theo responded with disarming charm, turning every conversation into a dangerous dance between truth and deception. But Alexander began to notice that despite Theo's impeccable facade, cracks were beginning to show. Small inconsistencies in his answers were like beacons in the fog. Meanwhile, James Klein became Alexander's most reliable ally. His experience and composure helped maintain focus on the goal. He encouraged Alexander not to act impulsively, reminding him that a single mistake could cost not only the institute's reputation but also the integrity of the investigation. Every analyzed document and every reviewed transaction were steps toward the truth, even if that truth was devastating. Melanie found an unexpected ally in Sophia, the colleague who had initially doubted her. When Melanie shared more details of what she knew, Sophia began to see that it wasn't baseless paranoia. Though still hesitant, she agreed to help Melanie keep a closer watch on Theo while discreetly sharing information with Alexander. The strength of their growing friendship brought Melanie a sense of relief she hadn't realized she needed. Theo, for his part, began to feel the walls closing in. Though he maintained his composure, there was something different about the behavior of those around him. Alexander was more distant, more analytical. Even the staff seemed more attentive to his actions. He knew he needed to accelerate his plan before it was too late. The map, locked in the Institute's vault, was his last piece on the chessboard, and he was determined to play it. Melanie and Sophia, as they monitored Theo, uncovered more clues that strengthened their suspicions. A chance overheard conversation revealed that Theo had an external contact waiting to receive the map. This increased the urgency of the situation. Melanie took the information directly to Alexander, who now had no doubts that swift action was necessary. But time seemed to be against them. As Alexander gathered the final pieces of evidence, Theo worked to consolidate his plan. He began transferring critical documents out of the institute, using his position of trust to disguise his actions. Every move was risky, but Theo trusted his ability to manipulate those around him. After all, he had always been the man everyone believed in without question. It was his greatest strength, and perhaps his greatest weakness. Alexander's allies, Melanie, Sophia, and James, began working as an improvised team. They shared information, kept watch on Theo, and prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Each day brought new challenges but also reinforced their determination to protect the Institute's legacy. For Melanie, this was more than a mission. It was her chance to prove that she was more than just a museum guide, that her voice mattered. Finally, the pieces began to fall into place. A misplaced forged document and a suspicious bank transaction provided the final proof Alexander needed. The tension was nearly unbearable, but he knew the moment to act was near. The confrontation with Theo was no longer a question of if, but when. As everyone braced for the outcome, Melanie realized she was more prepared for what lay ahead than she had ever imagined. Alexander entered the institute that morning with a quiet determination. He had spent the night reviewing, cross-referencing information, and piecing together the puzzle that Melanie, James, and Sophia had helped him build. The evidence was clear. Theo had forged financial records, manipulated data, and most egregiously, planned to steal the map. The weight of the betrayal felt like a stone on his chest, but he knew there was no room for hesitation. The time to confront Theo was approaching. From a distance, Melanie watched with nerves on edge. Despite everything she had done, she couldn't shake the fear that something might go wrong. Theo was intelligent, persuasive, and even dangerous. But something inside her reassured her that she was on the right path. She remembered all the times she had felt invisible and realized there was no more time for self-doubt. The hidden cavern was just ahead, and she couldn't turn back. Theo, unaware of what was coming, acted as though the institute was still the kingdom he controlled. He spent the morning reviewing documents and coordinating tasks with his usual confidence. His ability to hide secrets and mask intentions was almost a natural talent. Yet deep down, he felt an unease he couldn't explain. Perhaps it was Alexander's scrutinizing gaze or the subtle changes in his team's behavior. Something was different. In the office, Alexander and James outlined the final details of their plan. They knew the confrontation had to be precise and calculated. There was too much at stake: the Institute's reputation, the integrity of their work, and even the safety of everyone involved. For Alexander, the hardest part was accepting that Theo, the man he considered a brother, had orchestrated all of this. But he knew that protecting the legacy he had built was more important than any personal bond. Meanwhile, Melanie and Sophia prepared for their roles. Melanie, in particular, knew her work wasn't done yet. The courage that had brought her this far needed to sustain her in the critical moment. Every move Theo made was closely monitored. Every word was listened to with heightened attention. The atmosphere in the institute was tense, almost suffocating, and everyone knew they were about to cross a point of no return. At the end of the day, Alexander summoned Theo to his office for a meeting. The environment was carefully set to appear casual, but the tension was palpable. Theo entered with his usual confident demeanor, but something in Alexander's eyes unsettled him. "I want to discuss some important points about the recent expeditions," Alexander began, his tone neutral. But the atmosphere said otherwise. Theo could feel the heat of the confrontation approaching. Melanie, positioned discreetly outside, held her breath. She knew the moment was imminent. Her heart raced, but she didn't retreat. Despite her fear, she felt a strange sense of purpose. Everything she had fought for in recent days culminated in this moment. And for the first time, she felt she was exactly where she needed to be. Alexander began presenting the evidence methodically. Each document, each transaction, and every detail of Theo's plan was laid out calmly and precisely. At first, Theo tried to deflect and deny, but as the evidence mounted, his facade began to crumble. He realized he was cornered. Alexander's gaze was sharp, but it also carried the pain of someone who had been deeply betrayed. As Theo attempted to defend himself, claiming misunderstandings and coincidences, Alexander felt the weight of the decision he would have to make. He knew the final confrontation was imminent, but he also understood that this moment was not just about exposing Theo. It was about protecting what truly mattered, preserving the legacy he and so many others had worked so hard to build. The stage was set, the pieces in position, and the confrontation was about to erupt. Melanie, standing outside, closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. She knew the hidden cavern lay just ahead, but she also understood that within it were not just shadows but the light of truth. The resolution was near, and no one would emerge unscathed. Alexander's office felt too small to contain the growing tension. Theo sat before him, but he no longer exuded the same confidence. Each piece of evidence Alexander presented was like a blow, slowly dismantling the armor of justifications and lies Theo had built. The heavy air seemed to vibrate between them, as if the very room acknowledged the gravity of the moment. Alexander, though firm, felt the weight of betrayal sinking deep into his chest. "I trusted you, Theo." For years. Alexander's voice carried more disappointment than anger, which somehow made it worse. Theo made one last appeal, his voice tinged with bitterness that had been building for a long time. "And what did I get in return? Always in the shadow of the great Alexander Warren, always the right hand but never the mind behind the success." His tone was a mix of revolt and justification, a confession disguised as defense. Outside, Melanie listened to snippets of the conversation, her heart pounding. Every word Theo uttered confirmed what she already knew, but hearing his bitterness so explicitly was still shocking. She couldn't imagine what Alexander was feeling as he faced this truth head-on. To her, Theo was the villain of the story, but to Alexander he was a friend, almost a brother. The contrast between their perspectives made the moment all the more painful. Alexander, still maintaining control, responded with cutting calm, "You had choices, Theo. We all do. But you chose to betray everything we built together, to betray the people who trusted you." Theo's expression hardened. He knew he was cornered, but his arrogance wouldn't allow him to admit defeat. "I did what needed to be done. Someone had to seize the opportunity. You would never understand." As the argument reached its peak, James Klein entered the office, carrying the documented evidence that would close any loophole Theo might have tried to exploit. It was the final blow. Theo looked at James, then at Alexander, realizing there was no escape. "You think you can destroy me like this? I know more about this institute than any of you can imagine." His threat hung in the air, but Alexander didn't waver. Even outside the room, Melanie felt a chill at Theo's tone. He wasn't just someone plotting a theft, he was someone willing to destroy everything if he couldn't have what he wanted. But Alexander didn't give in to the provocation. He stood, meeting Theo's gaze directly. "You made your choices, Theo. Now, you'll face the consequences." With a gesture, he signaled to James that it was time to close this chapter. Outside, Melanie felt a mix of relief and unease. The confrontation was over, but what came next was still shrouded in uncertainty. She knew this moment marked the end of an era for Alexander and the Institute, but she also sensed that something new was beginning. The proof of her courage and Alexander's lay in the decisions made and the legacy they chose to protect. Theo was escorted out of the Institute, leaving behind the weight of his betrayal. But for Alexander, the moment wasn't over. He sat back in his chair, exhausted as he stared at the documents scattered across his desk. The pain of losing someone he had considered part of his life was evident in his expression. He knew he would need time to process everything, but he also knew there was something, or someone, that would help him move forward. Melanie stepped hesitantly into the office. Alexander looked up and, for the first time, smiled at her with a mix of gratitude and respect. "You changed everything, Melanie," he said, with a sincerity she hadn't expected. Those simple words were the validation Melanie had never realized she needed. But for both of them, this victory was just the beginning of a journey that would bring more challenges and opportunities. The silence in Alexander's office was a welcome relief after the storm. Theo was gone, and the painful truth was finally in the open. Alexander, still seated, gazed at the documents that had served as evidence against his former right-hand man. The weight of the day was etched on his face. Yet, in that moment, he also felt a newfound lightness, the realization that, despite everything, the Institute's legacy was safe. And that was thanks in large part to Melanie. Melanie stood awkwardly, unsure of what to do, as she watched Alexander. She was still trying to absorb everything that had happened. Her actions, which had seemed so small at first, had triggered monumental change. "I just did what I thought was right," she said, breaking the silence. But Alexander knew it was more than just doing the right thing. It was courage, something he recognized as essential but didn't always find in the people around him. After a few moments, Alexander stood and approached her. "Melanie, you did more than that. You risked everything for what you believed in. And honestly, if you hadn't spoken up, I don't know what would have happened." Those unexpected words made Melanie feel a mix of pride and nervousness. She had always thought Alexander barely knew her name, yet here they were, standing as allies. Alexander knew the moment called for more than just a simple thank you. He looked at Melanie thoughtfully before saying, "You have talent, Melanie, and you shouldn't be limited to guiding visitors through the museum. We need people like you, with passion and integrity, at the heart of the Institute." The offer hung in the air, a surprise she hadn't anticipated. "If you're willing, I'd like you to join the research team. I want you to be part of what we're building here." Melanie felt the ground disappear beneath her for a moment. This was what she had always wanted but never dared believe was possible. A million thoughts raced through her mind. Her insecurities, the fear of failure, but also the excitement of finally being able to use her knowledge in a meaningful way. "I don't know what to say," she responded, still trying to process it. But deep down, she knew exactly what she wanted. "Yes, I accept." Alexander smiled, and in that smile was something more than professional approval. It was respect, something he didn't grant easily. "Welcome to the team, An. But I'll warn you now, it won't be easy." Melanie laughed, easing some of the tension. "After everything we've been through, I think I'm ready for whatever comes next." The confidence in her voice surprised even herself. For the first time, she felt she was exactly where she belonged. In the days that followed, the dynamics at the institute began to change. Theo had left behind a void, but also a sense of renewed energy. Alexander, though still grappling with the weight of betrayal, found new inspiration in Melanie. His vision, once so shaken, began to rebuild itself. He realized the institute could rise again, and now he had a team that shared his passion and values. For Melanie, the transition from museum guide to researcher was like stepping into a new world. She threw herself into the work with enthusiasm, learning from every challenge and contributing in ways she had never imagined. The feeling of being seen, finally recognized, was a reward that made all the risks she had taken worthwhile. Above all, she knew she had found her place, and this was only the beginning. The institute soon became a revitalized space, and Melanie quickly realized her journey was far from over. Her new role as a researcher brought unexpected challenges but also infinite opportunities. She now had access to documents she had only dreamed of studying, and Alexander's trust gave her the encouragement she needed to explore her ideas. Alongside her new team, she began writing her own story within a space that had once seemed so distant and unattainable. Alexander, meanwhile, spent his days reorganizing the institute's direction. The trust that had been shattered by Theo's betrayal was slowly being restored, especially with Melanie's support. Though still the leader, he learned to listen more, to trust his team more, and above all, to recognize the values that truly mattered. He now understood that the Institute's legacy wasn't just in its discoveries but in the people he chose to walk alongside him. For Melanie, returning to the Institute felt like returning to the life she had always wanted, but with a different weight. She knew her courage had been the catalyst, but Alexander's trust had allowed her to go further than she had imagined. Her new role wasn't just a professional opportunity, it was a chance to prove to herself that her passion for civilizations and artifacts was more than just an interest, it was her purpose. Over the weeks, Melanie became a key part of the research team. Her curiosity and dedication were undeniable, and her colleagues began to see her not just as a collaborator but as a leader. She knew that, deep down, this wasn't just a return to her work at the Institute, it was a return to what had always been hers, her true calling. With each passing day, she felt closer to the future she had always imagined but thought was impossible to reach. But the path forward wasn't simple. Melanie still wrestled with lingering doubts, especially within herself. She knew others saw her in a new light, but in quiet moments, she questioned the legitimacy of her position. She feared that the brilliance of her rise might be temporary, soon overshadowed by other issues. Yet, as time went on, she began to realize those doubts were just remnants of her past, fading as she proved herself day after day. As Melanie took her first steps toward her new future, Alexander faced his own transformation. The confrontation with Theo had made him question his choices and the values he placed in partnerships. He learned that trust shouldn't be blind but earned over time, a lesson he was integrating into his journey. He no longer wanted to rely on appearances or titles. He wanted to trust people for who they truly were. The Institute began to expand its horizons, with new discoveries and projects taking shape. Melanie and Alexander, together, became a revitalizing force. Though the past betrayal and mistrust left some scars, there was also a profound sense of gratitude for what had been learned and what had been rebuilt. Each new discovery was a small victory, not just for the Institute but for everyone within it. Melanie knew she wasn't just protecting the legacy of the past, she was creating a new future. And on this shared journey, Melanie and Alexander discovered a new way of collaborating, not based on hierarchy but on mutual respect. Slowly, they became partners in a work that transcended the professional. The Institute was no longer just a workplace but a true community, where everyone's dreams and ideals came together in a collective effort to preserve the past while building the future. The impact of Theo's betrayal was far from fully overcome. Over time, Alexander learned to cope with the pain of losing a friend and partner. The weight of disappointment doesn't fade easily, and even on calmer days, he felt the shadow of what had been lost. But his journey had something renewing about it. Through the pain, he found strength. A strength rooted in the deep understanding that the road ahead would be more resilient, more mindful. He no longer needed to trust blindly. He had learned to trust the people around him with a more balanced and genuine confidence. Melanie, in turn, was undergoing her own transformation. The Institute, once just a distant dream, was now in her hands. But more than that, she was becoming a leader, someone capable of guiding others with the same courage that had made her stand up that fateful day to tell Alexander about Theo's plans. In a way, she was emerging from the shadows of doubt, discovering with each new project that her voice carried weight, that her ideas could transform not just her life but the lives of those around her. Melanie's resilience wasn't just in her ability to withstand pressure but also in her talent for learning from every challenge. She knew her journey hadn't been easy, but she also understood that, no matter how difficult the obstacles had been, each had shaped her into the woman she had become. In every archaeological discovery she helped uncover, she saw a reflection of her own journey of overcoming adversity. It didn't matter how dark the origin of something was. What mattered was what could be done to illuminate the future. For Alexander, his revival came in his ability to see people differently. He realized he didn't just need allies, he needed mutual trust, where everyone was willing to lift one another. Theo's loss, though painful, paved the way for a stronger, more united institute. He was no longer the sole beacon within the institution. Now he was part of a team, a community. Above all, he had learned to value people, recognizing that no matter how brilliant the discoveries, the true treasure lay in the relationships built along the way. Day by day, the institute expanded, with new discoveries emerging thanks to Melanie's involvement. Her role was no longer confined to guiding tours. She now led research teams, and her ideas were as influential as those of any renowned historian. She had become a central figure on the team, respected not just for her passion but for her courage to act when no one else dared. Alexander, though still guiding the institute, felt comfortable delegating many responsibilities to Melanie, burdens he had once carried alone. He trusted her, a trust he knew he couldn't place in just anyone. Trust became, more and more, the foundation of their joint work. Now recognized for her achievements, Melanie felt her life had finally found balance. She had reached a professional status she once thought was beyond her reality, but more importantly, she had achieved emotional self-sufficiency. She had freed herself from the insecurities that had haunted her since her early days at the museum. Now she knew the true journey lay in staying true to herself, relying on her inner strength even in the face of adversity. Alexander's resurrection, in turn, lay in his renewed confidence. The pain of seeing his closest ally betray him couldn't be erased, but he learned that life goes on, and new allies can be gained, new relationships cultivated. The Institute was no longer just a reflection of his success but a mirror of collective growth. He understood that his legacy was built on the choices he made now. He was a guardian of the past but also a creator of a fairer and more supportive future. Together, Alexander and Melanie were no longer just a historian and a guide. They were partners, mentor and apprentice, but also equals in the mission to preserve the past while transforming it into a bridge for a stronger, renewed future. They faced their own challenges, their own doubts, but one thing was clear: together, they had the power to make a difference. The Institute and their own lives were in constant renewal, filling them with an energy no obstacle could extinguish. The Institute was never the same after Theo's downfall. The upheavals that marked the crisis gave way to a new era of renewal. Melanie and Alexander together transformed what could have been an irreparable tragedy into an opportunity for growth. The legacy Theo tried to destroy was now stronger than ever, rooted in trust, courage, and the commitment each brought to the Institute. Melanie, who began her journey as a simple museum guide, now found herself one of the institution's leading researchers. Her life had undergone a complete transformation, and what once seemed like a dead end now revealed itself as an open road to the future. She had not only achieved the position of her dreams but also gained the trust and respect of those around her. The girl who feared she wouldn't be heard had now become the voice of a new generation of scholars and archaeologists. For Alexander, the institute had become more than just an academic institution. With Melanie and the renewed team, he began to see the true purpose of his work. He was no longer the sole protagonist of the legacy he held so dear but part of a team that shared his vision and values. His return after Theo's betrayal was not just physical, it was emotional and psychological. He had risen from the pain and loss and now led with a renewed understanding of the importance of trust and collaboration. With each new discovery, Melanie and Alexander grew closer to realizing the Institute's full potential. The archaeological treasures, now safeguarded by a much stronger security network, were uncovered with greater precision, more respect for the past, and more enthusiasm for the future. What began with a single discovery had now expanded into a series of projects placing the Institute on the global archaeological map. The world seemed to be watching the Institute, bringing new opportunities. International partners, sponsors, and universities reached out to collaborate. Melanie, in her new role as a lead researcher, became a central figure in negotiations and projects. She knew Alexander's confidence in her abilities was not just professional but a genuine recognition of her value. More importantly, the true elixir Melanie and Alexander had found was personal transformation. They were no longer the same people who began this journey. Melanie had learned to trust herself, to believe in her voice and her worth. Alexander, on the other hand, had learned to trust others genuinely, not to be consumed by the fear of betrayal but to embrace the potential of those around him. Together, they had salvaged something far more precious than the map Theo had tried to steal. They had rediscovered the true meaning of teamwork, trust, and renewal. And with that, a new chapter was being written, not just for the Institute but for their own lives. What they were building was not merely an academic legacy but a community, a space for innovation and mutual respect. Melanie and Alexander, as they looked toward the future, knew the road ahead would be long. But they also understood that with the renewal they had found, they were ready to face any challenge. The Institute would grow, and the discoveries yet to come would be even more extraordinary than those of the past. But the greatest treasure of all, they knew, was the trust they had cultivated. And that was the elixir capable of transforming not just the Institute but the world around them.